Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to break a little Houston Institute tradition and begin a little closer to 4 than usual. I want to welcome you all here to Harvard Law School. I'm David Harris from the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. We're really pleased to have this presentation today. And as always, as we near the end of the semester, I want to just give a shout about a couple of events we have coming up. On April 22nd, Aisha McAdams-Mahmood is going to give a presentation on some work she's done on storytelling, public health, and justice. And she'll be joined by Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett, who was her mentor and also a very prominent public health person in her own right. The next day, we'll have Robert Hooks and his wife here for an event co-sponsored by the ART, and he'll be talking to us about his career and about the status of blacks in Hollywood. So in many respects, today's event is a kind of fitting bookend to an event we did earlier this year with Mayor Karen Weaver from Flint, Michigan. And that was part of an event we called Dispatches from the Front Lines of Community Justice. When we did that event, my wife was reading a book called Poisoned. And she says to me, wow, David, we should see about this book. We should see about getting this person here. So my wife works at the Tufts Program on Public Health, and I said, well, maybe we should both get her here. And so this event is a matter of marital bliss because Anna was at Tufts yesterday, and my wife came home and was very excited about that, and we're really pleased to have her here with us today. So that means that in addition to Kelly Garvin, to whom I always give thanks and praise for making all these events help, I have to give a big shout to my wife, Janet Walton. And those of you who are used to my generally cryptic introductions, I'm going to stray a little bit today, although I'm going to eschew the kind of catalog chronicle format. But as I was digging around trying to look at Anna Clark's bio, I found some very interesting things. And I found one particularly quotable article that I mentioned and kind of embarrassed her with. But it was written by I don't know if she was an undergrad or not, but it was in the ASU, Arizona State University online journal. And in it, it was called Anna Clark, Your New Criminal Justice Role Model. And this young woman, whose name was Bridget Todd, began her article by saying, when people used to ask what I wanted to be when I grew up, I'd often say I wanted to be a journalist, a novelist, an activist, and an educator. Obviously, that seems like way too many awesome gigs for one person to squeeze into one lifetime. That is, unless you're Anna Clark. Clark calls herself a, quote, progressive person interested in creative approaches to art and justice work. So Todd goes on to write, working as an independent journalist, Clark manages to live professionally at the intersection of writing, activism, social justice, and education. Currently, she writes about stories tangled up with prisons, detention, and the criminal justice system. Now, for all of those who know us, that's our stuff, right? That's what we do, too. And then perhaps what she goes on to say that perhaps one of the most interesting ways Clark uses writing is as a tool to engage inmates in prisons and detention centers. Through the Prison Creative Arts Project, she facilitates weekly writing and theater workshops for the incarcerated. Now, unfortunately, Kaya Stern isn't here with us, but she started something called the Prison Studies Project and does this kind of work, and it's really wonderful to have somebody who shares this. However, that's not the end of it, because there's a local connection. And that local connection is through Haley House. And in this interview, the author talked to Anna, and Anna made this comment. She described herself as all about making the political personal, taking our beliefs and making them day-to-day practicalities. We had, for example, a radical soup kitchen in our home, ran an open-door food pantry, farmed with guys who were homeless, who became part of our community, offered cooking classes to neighborhood teens, ran a bakery, and all sorts of other things that emerge when you fuse your living, working, and volunteering worlds, bringing them together into the same space. It can't be summarized like a program blurb. I was very much transformed by it all, which is to say, it was hard and exciting. All of this is about a woman who has also written on the origins of instant replay in football. Right? See, I dug very deep. But we're here today because of her book, Poisoned, which is a 2019 Michigan Notable Book, won a State History Award, and has been long listed for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. It was also a finalist for the Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. So obviously, I'm very happy, pleased, and excited to welcome Anna Clark today. And after her talk, the Coop will be here selling her book at Coop membership prices, which I don't know exactly right now, but we'll know by the end of the session. So with no further ado, Anna Clark.
I swear to God, he's like, here's a quote where she's going to, that she said. I had no idea what I said. That was some deep digging. I am really floored and delighted. And oh my God, it's Kathy. She's right there. That's Kathy from Haley House, guys. I am so honored to be here for a lot of reasons. I really had a wonderful time with the community at Tufts yesterday. I feel excited to share this project and story that has been very close to my heart and mind for the last few years, in some ways my whole life. And also, yes, you know, like having some connections to Boston and having an opportunity to come back here for the first time in many years has been overwhelming. I've spent the better part of today just feeling just dizzy with all the feelings of it. So thank you all who made it possible, and thank you to everyone who came out here. This is gonna be great. Let me get this kind of set up. There we go. I'm going to try to get it a little bit out of the way. Right? Well, I get the microphone. Okay, so you're going to see my silhouette. It's just how it is. So I usually like to begin with the water. So I come from the state of Michigan, with a state that's literally shaped by the 5 inland seas that we call the Great Lakes, right? The lakes are extraordinary. They hold more than 20% of all the fresh water on the face of the planet. They have so much water that if you spilled it out over the lower 48 states, it would fill the Grand Canyon before settling at an even depth of 10 feet. It's gifted Michigan with more coastline than any other state except Alaska. It's an extraordinary resource, and one that's been really pivotal not only to the economic and recreation life of the 8 states and 2 Canadian provinces that border it, but it's also been a really important part of the emotional life, the psychic life of those who are from this place, including little Anna, who grew up near Lake Michigan and considers it the landscape of her very soul. And yet somehow this state, amidst this abundance, we poison an entire city with its drinking water. Flint, Michigan is a city of almost 100,000 people. It's 70 miles from Lake Huron in one direction and 70 miles from Saginaw Bay in the other. And yet it learned to see the drinking water coming from its taps as a threat, as a danger, as something that was life-taking instead of life-giving. Before I go too much further, is anybody from Flint or has been to Flint or worked in Flint? Or oh, there's a couple. Oh, a few. Hey. Okay, great. That's good. That can hopefully make this conversation a little bit more, bring more texture to it. I feel like a lot of times when we talk about Flint, we talk about what it's lost, right? It's just this chronicle of absence. You know, it's lost people, it's lost industry and jobs, it's lost public services, but we don't often talk about what's there. So just to give a little bit of a peek at it, Flint, besides being full of nearly 100,000 people, it also is home to several very cute neighborhood cafes where If you are a reporter, you might sit in said cafe and just wait, and everybody you want to talk to will eventually come through. They're neighborhood nerve centers. It's got a very lovely public library, very sunny and engaging. It has programming that meets lots of different kinds of people. It's got this really distinctive city hall where Mayor Karen Weaver works out of. And this dome here is where public meetings are held, including a number that were really pivotal during the run-up to this water disaster. Over on the north side of Flint, there's something called Burstyn Fieldhouse. Any famous athlete you've ever heard of has probably had some interaction with Burstyn. It fell into disrepair in some recent years, but it's been in the midst of a revival in a number of ways. It's got, in the summers, it's pretty much an all-day neighborhood festival where people are playing intramural softball, eating barbecue, talking to anybody they come across. The community built a new playground there that's really well used and well cared for. Flint is also home to 4 colleges, the University of Michigan's Flint campus, Kettering University, which is a cooperative engineering school, also Mott Community College and Baker College campus. It has the largest planetarium in the state. That was the day of the eclipse. It was a really fun place to watch it. And it also has this relatively new site for its farmers market. Really, really popular, really beloved point of pride for folks in the community. I'm embarrassed as a journalist that it took me a long time to realize that this was, the farmers market is in a repurposed newspaper printing plant, which is really cool. It's a good reuse. And of course, Flint's also the site of this very confusing, very complex, very disastrous water story. This was almost exactly 5 years ago. This was April 24th, maybe April 25th, 2014. This was the day of the water switch that has become so infamous. So just the quick rundown of what happened here. The city of Flint had been drinking Great Lakes water for more than 50 years. It got water from Lake Huron through Detroit's water department. And it had a number of gripes about the water. Residents were paying really extremely high water rates, some of the most expensive water rates in the country. The city felt taken for granted by Detroit's water system, felt like as, essentially the largest customer, they felt like they deserved a seat on the board and more say with negotiating power, things like that. But the water quality was good. The water quality they had never had a real problem with at all. Also important background information is the fact that the city of Flint was under emergency management. So in Michigan, this is a system of state oversight that is quite expansive. So the idea, according to the state, what they do according to the law, is the state will send an appointed administrator to a struggling city or school district, and that administrator will hold all the power that would ordinarily be held by a mayor and city council or a superintendent and school board. And they hold additional powers besides. So the mayor and the city council don't have any authority at all unless the emergency manager gives it to them. The emergency manager also has additional powers they can unilaterally make or break a union contract or sell city assets or a number of other tasks. The one thing they can't do is miss a bond payment. And they effectively stay indefinitely, too. According to the law, they have an 18-month time limit, the idea being, we'll bring in this outsider who has no worries about re-election, isn't tied into local politics, they'll make these hard decisions, and they're going to get out, But in practice, an emergency manager will resign just before that 18-month deadline, and then a new one will be appointed, and clock goes on. So Flint had an emergency manager for 3.5 years, which is really important because that's when all these key decisions happened with the water. So while under emergency management, the city decided it was going to leave Detroit's water system, and it was going to join a brand new water system. But this new water system wasn't yet built, and so for the 2 or 3 years it was going to take for that new plant to be operational, they decided they were going to reboot their old city plant and use water from the Flint River and deliver it to residents. And as you can see, this was really celebrated. This is from a press conference on the day of the switch at the water plant. Everybody in these images really regrets this. But you can see in these images the emergency manager, the mayor, the city council, folks with public works and the Department of Environmental Quality. But even well beyond that, there's a lot of people who really celebrated this as this move as a way for the city to like reclaim its self-sovereignty, like our beleaguered town can get back to its roots and show it can take care of itself. And this was kind of the here's to Flint rhetoric as the toast went on this day. Now, one of the myths of the water crisis is that the Flint River itself was so polluted that it inevitably made people sick. And this story has some truth in it because the Flint River, like urban waterways all over the country, was treated like an open sewer for 100+ years, right? Boston knows this. It was like there was literally not one restriction on what you could dump into water and how much of it you could dump until the 70s. So peak industrial age, they were, you know, these were toxic places. In Flint, of course, is like the birthplace of General Motors as a real industrial hub. Like, you know, this river was treated terribly, and generations of people grew up learning to be wary of it, to don't drink from it, don't swim in it, don't eat fish you catch from it, don't, you know, they traded terrible stories of things they would see in it. And the river still does have some challenges, it's true, but it has had the benefit of a couple generations of environmental regulations, and also, frankly, one benefit of deindustrialization, like having fewer polluting industries in town, is that you have fewer polluting industries in town. And that's kind of had it, you know, that's one upside of what happened of the water. And a lot of people have been trying to work hard to caretake for it and clean it up and rebuild relationships with the Flint River. In this man-made disaster, it was more about how the water was treated or not treated. It was, there's a few different things that were at play. Like, so first of all, that old city plant that got rebooted, it wasn't sufficient upgrades or staffing to treat a more complex water source properly. And you know intuitively that any river would be a more complex water source because, for example, if you took a ladle full of water from one of the Great Lakes versus a ladle full of water from any river, like the river water will be more cloudy. You can picture it's like more organic matter, right? But the city plant wasn't equipped to filter that properly and all that. But the most serious thing was that they weren't treating the water with something called corrosion control. And this was the piece that was breaking federal law. And it was crucially important. Corrosion control is what you're supposed to add to water at the treatment plant so that when it passes through what is almost universally really old breaking down drinking water infrastructure, it helps keep those like little fragments of metal and so on from contaminating the water so that you can drink it when it gets to your taps. It doesn't solve all the problems. It's not a foolproof solution. We absolutely should be investing in our drinking water infrastructure in a way we have not since they were built, basically. But it helps, and it is the law. But it wasn't happening in Flint, not for a short time, but for a long time. So you can imagine if you have no corrosion control and you have a water source that is, like any river, more corrosive, it's pretty intuitive what you're going to get. You're going to get corroded pipes. And these are actual pipes from Flint. They were breaking down. When you saw people holding up bottles of water that were brown or orange or discolored. I mean, that was literally rust. That was rust that was coming out into their water. What you couldn't see was lead, which is not visible to the human eye, but is one of the world's best known neurotoxins and especially dangerous for children. It's also, you couldn't see a number of other water problems that were serious but didn't get the same attention that lead did, including several E. coli bacteria violations, a violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act that for a byproduct that in the amount that was in the water can cause cancer, and also a 2-year outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, which was not made public until after Flint was in the national spotlight, but that was quite serious because Legionnaire's disease is, it's basically a serious type of pneumonia that you contract when you, from a waterborne bacteria that you can breathe in, like when it's in a steam or vapor, like when you're taking a shower or washing dishes or something like that. So this is haunting, right? This is like this Great Lakes town learned that its water was dangerous. And I cannot emphasize enough how intimate of a betrayal this is, right? It doesn't just affect your ability to have a glass of water with your dinner, though that's important enough. But it's also, you have to think about it every single second, like when you're making your coffee or filling an ice cube tray or filling a bowl of water for your pet or mixing formula for an infant. It's everywhere. There was one woman I talked to, she's a community health professional, and she had gotten in the habit of keeping a crock pot in her home and, or in her bathroom, and filling it with bottled water and heating up the water that way and then dumping it in her tub so she could wash. She did that for a very long time and might still be doing it, I don't know. Several parents have talked about just how, even though it's not their fault, they just feel guilty. They feel like, they've been trying to steer their kids away from soda and juice and encourage them to drink water because they're trying to be a good parent. And then to find out all along this water is harming them, and can have with consequences that can be permanent and incurable. That's crazy. It's absolutely chilling. And the fact is too, I mean, the pipes get worse over time, right? They continue to break down. The longer this crisis went without those who had power to shift course, hearing, being attentive to folks in the community who noticed very early on that the water wasn't right, the longer that they were ignored and dismissed and actively belittled, the worse this problem was getting. And it was absolutely, it absolutely had life and death consequences, from those who died from Legionnaire's disease to those who were just generation of children who was unnecessarily exposed to the lead from these breaking down pipes. Now with the book though, I wanted to not just bring clarity over how this water crisis played out over the last few years, though I hope I did that, but I also wanted to ask the question of what makes a city vulnerable to something like this in the first place. And for that question, to tell the story of infrastructure inequality in this country, you have to go back a few generations. So this is Flint in the 1960s. I'm going to tell a story that might sound like a tangent, but you're going to see how it all comes together. It's all connected. So Flint in the 1960s is a really different city than it is today. It's got twice as many people, 200,000 people. It's got, it's still chuffing with General Motors plants and a number of other industries. This is a destination city for people all over the country and world for very good paying jobs that made it possible for people to buy very cute single-family homes. Flint also had this really well-known community schools movement. They were pioneers on this, really, figuring out how to use schools that children attended and activate them in ways to meet needs for families throughout the neighborhood, you know, meeting social service needs, adult education needs, things like that. They programmed them till late at night. It also was like full of trees. I spent some time looking at photos that were in the Parks and Rec department, and there was this like proud photo of what was the urban forestry division of the Parks Department. They had like 11 dudes who all they did was like plant trees and maintain them all day. It was beautiful. It's like, oh, we should do that again. But Flint was also super, super segregated. It was, by one academic measure, the most segregated city in the North and the third most segregated city nationwide. It was excruciatingly held boundaries. And as more and more people were coming to the city, most particularly African Americans coming north through the Great Migration, this was becoming increasingly tense situation. Besides being immoral, it was logistically hitting its limits, because with only 2 neighborhoods where they were allowed to live, you can imagine they were getting more crowded. There were more and more predatory conditions where people could, for example, charge astonishingly high rents and not keep buildings up to any kind of code at all, and they could get away with it because where else can those tenants move? Nowhere. That context is part of what makes it a little surprising that Flint also had an African-American mayor. It had, this is Floyd McCree. He worked at a Buick foundry in Flint, and the mayor position at the time, it was appointed rather than elected. It was more like a city council president, but he was really one of the earliest African Americans to have such a role, and given that, he got a lot of national press for this, you know. This is from Jet magazine. He was somebody too who was like, oh, hello. Okay.
You don't have to stand in front of...
Oh, sure. Oh, thanks. Okay. Does it work? Is this working? Can you... Oh, it's okay. You could soak it in. Okay, I got it. Oh, thanks. Okay, so I'm just gonna hold this. So yeah, so Mayor McCree got a lot of national attention when he was appointed to this role, partly because of the kind of city he was leading, this like company town that was so segregated. Mayor McCree was very supportive of a fair housing ordinance in Flint, and was working very hard to get the city commission to vote on this. But it was an uphill battle, and of course, you know, just to be super clear, the boundaries of segregation in the city were enforced by all the ways I'm sure folks in this room are familiar with. It was enforced through racially restrictive covenants that made it explicitly illegal to integrate neighborhoods, even a little bit. Redlining, of course, made mortgages and housing insurance utterly inaccessible to people of color in the majority of the city. General Motors has some responsibility here too. They built thousands of homes in Flint and other cities for all the workers they wanted to work at their brand new plants. And you can look at these like old advertisements from the era where they're boasting of these like very cute homes that they built and the kind of neighborhoods they were creating, and they were, you know, and as to entice future home buyers, they're letting them know that in these neighborhoods there's no shacks, there's no outhouses, there's no liquor sales, and as if it is an equivalent nuisance, no foreign communities and no people of color. Like, you can just see it right down the list. And this is what brings us to July 1967. So, as you know, this was a very fiery month for this country. Detroit exploded in an uprising, a rebellion, a riot, and so did just after Newark did. And it was utterly devastating. And ultimately, more than 40 people died, thousands injured. It's utterly devastated the urban landscape in ways that the community is still dealing with in so many ways. What a lot of people don't realize is that with Detroit on fire, it was like little embers got like sent out to other cities around the state, like including Grand Rapids and Pontiac and Flint. What happened in Flint that very same week as Detroit was that there was a fair housing rally in North Flint, right near where those softball fields were, people urging the city commission to vote on a fair housing ordinance. It died down, and then some teenagers hung out afterwards and started throwing things, and they broke some windows, and this started this like conflagration. And just like in Detroit, there was a state of emergency, there was a curfew, there was a lot of arrests, it was a big thing. But what happened, the response in Flint was quite different than what happened in Detroit and some of the other cities that were on fire. So the mayor, McCree, and also the county prosecutor worked together on this unusual deal where the second day, they released all the people who had been arrested the first night with no charges at all on the condition that they help keep the peace the following night. And it worked. It worked. Almost all of them did. And in Flint, things died down after 2 days with no deaths and no serious injuries. It was very controversial, but looking what was going on for 5 days in Detroit, it was hard to suggest that, it was hard to argue with the results. And the city commission agreed to finally take up this fair housing ordinance. That's these guys. So so it's August 1967, and these guys are going to decide whether the Flint should continue purposefully disinvesting in certain neighborhoods in its country, destining them to infrastructure inequality based on the race and ethnicity. And the mayor makes his case here. He's like, I am a World War II veteran. My brother fought in World War II. Our father fought in World War I. And yet, the very people that we fought against in Europe can come to Flint and buy any house they want. And yet you're constricting the ability for the rest of us to like live our lives here. He's like, I urge you, his fellow commissioners, like, I urge you to like make the right decision here. So they whisper, they talk, they vote, and they're like, we like it how it is. We're going to keep segregation. And the mayor literally, at the table there, he literally just breaks down in tears. And he tells his colleagues that, he's like, 9 months ago when I was appointed to this position, we got a lot of national attention. Everybody thought that was very great. It was all very well. But as he says, I can't keep living this equal opportunity lie. And so he quits. And a number of other people started quitting in solidarity with him and in protest of this commission's vote. And this is beginning to get attention around the state and nation. The mayor was soon hospitalized with an ulcer and exhaustion, and he's visited by a nephew of his who's in his 20s. And they have a conversation in the hospital about where do we even go next? How do we, it took literally years to even get the commission to vote on this like fair housing thing. They say no, and like, what are we supposed to do when lives are literally on the line here? And the nephew comes up with this idea for sleep-in on the lawn of City Hall, that dome, with a building with a dome there. He and a lot of other people bring out their sleeping bags, and they say, hey, we're not going to leave until the City Commission reconsiders this fair housing ordinance. And they didn't leave, despite sprinklers being turned on and these intimidating patrols of fellows with guns. And as the days went on, more and more people started joining them, especially after they were featured in a 10-minute segment on a national news show, the Huntley-Brinkley Report. They were showing this culture of community organizing that I think in a very unique way in Flint has been passed down through generations. Besides this civil rights era, there was in the 1930s the what became the United Auto Workers. These were folks who worked at General Motors, one of the most powerful companies on the planet at the time. They occupied several different plants. They brought them to a total shutdown, and these sit-down strikers were saying that, like, until we get fairer wages and better working conditions and the right to collectively bargain, we're gonna stay. And they did. And they were the heat was turned off. They had to burn burlap to stay warm. They had what was called, like, what was it, like the Women's League or something like that? Their wives and they came to brigade. Yeah, they were bringing food and to them. They stayed for 44 days. And they won. And this was effectively the founding of the United Auto Workers that utterly changed the 20th century and the nation. Fun fact, while I was working on this, I found out my great-grandfather is one of them. I didn't know. But anyway, you could see a lot of the same methods and spirit used in the 60s with the fair housing movement. And you could also see it in more recent years with the water activism. I mean, another one of the myths that's often told about the water crisis is that it suggested that if Flint residents are to be praised, it is simply for enduring this disaster and various indignities, but they're absolutely agents at every step of the way, even without the power of their local government. Like, they did not have an empowered ability to vote any local official out of office or anything like that. Even without this indefinite suspension of their local democracy, they did everything they could think of to make themselves visible, and not just with protests and so on, but showing up at public meetings, lobbying folks in the state capitol, reaching out to the EPA, doing some, before they even understood what was going on, like trying to map out symptoms to try to get a picture of what was going on. They reached out to environmental experts and legal experts and water experts outside, the city to try to get some expertise, some insight, some help with what was going on. They are the reasons you and I are talking about this today. Those folks who were sleeping in at City Hall, they were also supported by a unity rally that showed up to take the side of fair housing and in support of the mayor. This was also headlined, these 5,000 people showing up for this rally. It was headlined by Governor George Romney, who is Mitt's dad, and also was a great supporter of fair housing, who would later go on to be the director of HUD under the Nixon administration. But his efforts to tie inclusionary housing policies to money for water projects proved deeply unpopular, and he was, in fact, pushed out of office. So that's interesting. Anyway, this is all too much, right? The city commission's like, all right, we're gonna vote, we're gonna do it again. They take up, the mayor returns to office, they work on what is a watered-down version of the ordinance, but in October of 1967, by a hair, it passes, which is terrific and amazing. It is. It was like very, very hard fought and very, very unlikely. But also, democracy is complicated, and this wasn't the end of the story. So within 5 minutes, petitions taken up to overturn the ordinance, literally in the same room. They quickly get enough signatures to put on the ballot, so it's suspended until people can vote. This coalition that opposed it included 50 known members of the Ku Klux Klan who did a literal parade down Saginaw Street in like robes and stuff, and they're like property rights. It was like they were challenged by a very broad coalition of people who supported the ordinance, and in short, nobody quite knew how this was going to shake out. The vote was February 1968. 40,000 people go to the polls, and by 30, after the recount, 30 votes, fair housing passes, which is unbelievable. Flint, Michigan, this company town, this mid-sized segregated town, becomes the first city in America to pass a fair housing ordinance by a popular vote. A similar ordinance had come up in Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, and Berkeley, California, and Toledo and Akron, Ohio, and all of them were rejected. Nationally, a fair housing ordinance seemed like it was never going to come. Congress was dragging its feet exactly like the city commission in Flint was. History would show us that we would actually get a national fair housing ordinance a few months later, but only in the immediate wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, which is a ridiculously high price to pay for that. So this was absolutely tremendous that the city of Flint ended up showing up for this. But this too is bittersweet. That vote happened in 1968. The 1970 census is the very first that shows Flint's population trending downward. And that downward trend has continued on to this very day and probably will continue through this next census, almost absolutely certainly. This is really important for a lot of reasons. And I should also just note, like, there's a lot of reasons why people were leaving the city, not least GM's, closing companies or closing plants and the changing global economic stuff. But, it's unmissable the fact that in the wake of school desegregation and fair housing laws, this city immediately began hollowing itself out. And like cities all over America, we now have like metropolitan areas that are, relatively whiter and wealthier, and these hollowed out core centers, core cities that are majority people of color and as disinvested in as those redline neighborhoods of the past. It's like we've expanded the scope of those redlining maps to include the whole city. Flint today has about the same number of people it had in 1920. It's about 54, 56% African American, about 40% white, and it also has a Latino population. And this is important for a lot of reasons. This is like part of what sets this the context for this like downward spiral that led to conditions that made the state feel like they're like, oh, it gave the state an opportunity to justify, to argue for, to say that we have to send an emergency manager here. But it also has other direct relations to the water as well. So people left, industry left. The drinking water infrastructure is exactly the same size as it ever was. This is why everybody's rates were so expensive, even before the switch. It was, you have fewer people who are shouldering the burden of a water system built for twice as many people, plus those huge industrial plants. Like in the 60s, General Motors was taking up like 60% of the city's total water intake. So the pipes are larger in circumference to meet those industrial needs, and the pipe, it's as a system, it's just like spread out very, very thin. And even with those expensive rates that are attempting to maintain this overlarge system, it's a mathematical impossibility. They're, first of all, Flint's a disproportionately poor community, so there's a whole other set of things that go with that. They can't pay it, but even if they could, Flint was losing 50% of its water just through leaks at the time of the switch, which of course made rates even more expensive. I mean, it was a new water supply wasn't going to be the solution here for the biggest problem Flint had with its water before the switch. It was a structural thing. It was literally, very concretely, it was a systemic problem. Another way this like directly related to the water is because of vacancies. So if you go to Flint today, you're still going to see a lot of these like really lovely historic homes. You can see this legacy of auto wealth in the past. It will not surprise you that these more dense neighborhoods were, the segregated white neighborhoods of the past. Everybody in the city was a victim of this water crisis. Everybody was. Most especially children. Of course, who lived in the city. Also commuters and college students, others who regularly were in the city, and folks who lived in the more dense neighborhoods. But those who lived in these neighborhoods were less likely to see the problems that others who lived in neighborhoods where there's more emptiness, right? If you go to Flint today, you're also going to see the remains that have been left behind, which is just what happens when half a city vanishes. I mean, it's like ghosts, right? Like you can see where these like structures that were homes to people, and for whole communities of people, and they're empty. And this is like, and in a neighborhood like this where there's more vacancy, the water that moves through the pipes is going to move through more slowly, right? So like if I live in this neighborhood and I have neighbors up and down, that means the water's moving quickly like through the pipes. In this neighborhood, or if you're next to a huge vacant auto plant or something, the water's going to like move at a trickle or even sit still for a while. And if you can picture those corroded pipes, you can imagine it just gets more saturated, more concentrated. So if you lived in this neighborhood, you are more likely to have brown water sooner than if you were living in this neighborhood. So while everybody in the city was harmed by this crisis, as usual, the harms were not distributed equally, and it is in these patterns, they're playing out the same patterns of infrastructure inequality in the past, because again, it won't surprise you that these poorer neighborhoods with more vacancy are also primarily people of color living in them. The need to move water more quickly was why you also saw a lot of, like, you know, in the recovery months, hydrants that were just spilling out water just to get it moving. There was also you know, flushing campaigns, trying to get everybody in the town to turn their faucet on 5 minutes every night. It was a mess. Another thing I try to do with this, book is I want to tell the story of what was singularly terrible about what happened in Flint, but I don't want to imply that this is only Flint's story, because it's not. The patterns of inequality are all over the country. These like democratic or undemocratic policies are, you know, have crept up in many different ways all over the country. And also just lead's everywhere, you guys. Like, we shouldn't have done it. It's really well known, and has been known for thousands of years, that it's toxic to people, which is a shame, because except for that part, it's really useful and great. I mean, there's a reason people wanted to use it. It's like abundant, it's malleable, it's durable, it's great, except for the poison part. But yeah, like, you know, of course, we had lead paint everywhere, that there was a very long movement to get the sales of those stopped. That was a great victory. We haven't fully dealt with the legacy of what's already there, right? It's still, you know, causing harm to people, disproportionately people of color in poor, dense urban communities. Another, just a random thing, like one thing I came across too with like paint, there's some people who believe that a lot of the physical and mental ailments that artists have struggled with, you know, 19th century and beyond, like might have been directly related to the white lead paint that they just used all the time. Of course, the leaded fuel, which was developed by Charles Kettering, that genius inventor that who did many good things, but not this, but who worked at GM and has a university in Flint named after him. We've known, like, the workers were like literally being poisoned by it, like dying and hallucinating. And we're like, you know, progress. We can handle it right. Like, the blame was on the workers for not handling it properly. It took an excessively long time to get leaded fuel off the market. That began in the 70s, it ended in the 90s. Again, a huge victory, but the legacy of the past is still with us, because the lead came out through exhaust, like in fumes, so it's all over the ground and our ice caps and everything like that. That's why you test the soil for lead before you garden in it. And of course, lead pipes are in all kinds of community, poor and wealthy, all kinds. They have been since Roman days. It's like a Caesar's name on a lead pipe. That's in fact how we get our words for plumbing and plumber. It's from the Latin word for lead. That's why it's PB on the periodic table. Lead pipes were banned for new structures in 1986, but that ban still allowed it to be 8% lead. That only went down to 0.25% in 2014. Most of us drink water from buildings that are built before then, and it would be a great idea to get rid of the lead pipes that are still with us and are getting old and breaking down anyway, even when the water's treated properly. And in another way, this isn't just Flint's story. I mean, we have seen for decades how when we concentrate poverty, when we concentrate vulnerability, people are in fact more vulnerable. Lead poisoning, the definition of it back in the early 1950s when this Baltimore Sun story ran was much, much narrower, like is way, like what they considered normal, what we would consider lead poisoning. So, but even with this like narrow definition, they were beginning to do some mapping of it, and they could tell that most cases are in slum areas. We're seeing the same patterns. We're talking about the same patterns that we always have been. Back in Flint, well, this is a very despairing story. Like one thing that is really quite beautiful about it is how instantly people's instincts were to try to figure out how to take care of each other, even before they understood totally what was going on. And even before anybody took them seriously. They were hosting their own bottled water drives and reaching out to homebound folks, and they really create a pretty wonderful blueprint for how to do that. One that I hope isn't forgotten or lost. I think, when I think about like what happened in Flint, I really think it makes me feel quite interested and curious about how do we, just like the lead that's built into our cities, like how do we deal with this history of inequality that is built into our cities? How do we reckon with what came before us and how it's still affecting us in very practical life and death ways to this very day? I hope Flint is a kind of wake-up call. 50 years ago, like the Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland like caught on fire. And it wasn't even the first time a river caught on fire or the first time that river caught on fire, but it's like, but that was the one where people were like, oh, enough, okay? This is how we've been doing it in the past. It's terrible. Water shouldn't catch on fire. We're going to do things better. I would like Flint, as dramatic and horrible as a story this is, and beautiful in the ways where a lot of people did do things that were well and right. I hope that's kind of like the spark, you know, that that helps us just deal with what we like to ignore and pretend we don't have to anymore. And of all places, I would like this state I'm particularly fond of, you know, this state that's like shaped by water to not be like a warning story, but I would like it to be a model in figuring out how to get water safely and accessibly and affordably and equitably to all people. I think that matters. Well, I mean, you have to do that first before you do anything else, right? So anyway, that's all I have to say. So thank you so much, everybody.
Do you want to do like questions or something? Yeah, questions. I think there should be another mic. This mic is here. So.
Great.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship? You discussed the emergency manager program. To what degree, if any, did that change or get revisited in the wake of the water crisis?
Thank you for giving me a chance to answer that. Just as a number of investigations like came in to explore what happened here, a lot of people, everybody, I think, even the governor's own, appointed commission, pointed to the emergency manager law as being a contributing factor here. While there are no actively serving emergency managers in Michigan right now, the unusually expansive law remains unchanged, and is part of what I would consider the unresolved work yet to be done about the Flint water crisis. So yeah, because it's right as of now, it's still a live wire.
Was there anything like what redeeming came out of like the state's response, like with like the Attorney General's investigation, the few folks that got like arrested or whatever? Was there anything that kind of like came out of that was like positive or created like lasting change?
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a mess and still unfolding in many ways, and partly because there's like this whole new administration that just came into place. It's like, I don't know, there's a lot of open questions. These like the criminal investigations and court cases and lawsuits, all of those are still active. Yet to be seen in a lot of cases what's going to happen. But one good thing is that Michigan did pass a law that was it requires like stricter than federal lead in water requirements, which is great. Like federally and most overall across the country, they're very, very lax and not attuned to a public health standard. A public health standard for lead is 0. Our laws allow some lead in the water because there's no way to get rid of it until we get rid of the lead, that's in the infrastructure. So, and they just assume that nobody ever will do that. So Michigan did pass a law that is an improvement on it, not as much as some activists wanted, but it does improve it. And also, like newly testing schools and child care centers, that's something that federally isn't required and most states don't do, even though children are most vulnerable. It also is set out like a 20-year mandate for cities to get rid of, all over the state, to get rid of lead pipes, which is tremendous, but it didn't come with any funding. So communities are pushing back on that, being like, that's impossible for us to do without some support. The state says, well, you have like a couple decades to do it, and you can work it out, and a couple other cities pre-Flint did figure out, including Lansing, Michigan, of all places, and they that tension there is unresolved, but I appreciate the goal of, if this could be the first state that got rid of all of its lead pipes, that'd be pretty extremely wonderful. Yes, sir.
I can add a lot of personal pieces to this one. I was born in Detroit, lived there through high school. Born in 46. By 1965, when I started high school, there were 1,100 and some students in my 9th grade class. In my elementary school, it was well integrated, although the neighborhoods were not. The blacks came from north of the Army Reserve field and very close to 8 Mile Road, if you've seen a movie called that. The whites lived south of that, but we went to the same elementary school. When the neighborhood started integrating in about 64, the white flight ended up in only 776 kids in my graduating class in Detroit from over 1,100. And the impetus for my being interested in going to law school, which I did here, was more about equity and justice than it was about making money and all those things that people go to law school for. And part of my career, 6.5 years, was at the Environmental Protection Agency, where I enforced unleaded gasoline regulations, where I enforced Clean Water Act, where we dealt with smelters that were puffing out hard metals, heavy metals like arsenic and lead, and we controlled those. And all of this stopped in 1981, January 20th, when Ronald Reagan was elected. He appointed as administrator of EPA Ann Gorsuch. Have you heard the name someplace else? The mother of Neil Gorsuch. Her position was to disassemble EPA. None of this would have happened had it not been for the election of Ronald Reagan and his business, let somebody else take care of it, low taxes, don't worry about anybody except yourself attitude. And I quit law at that point and became a high school math teacher and have enjoyed my career, which I'm now retired from.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing all that. That's amazing.
Anna, I'm curious about the graphic novel-like illustrations in your presentation.
I forgot to click over, but credit to Josh Kramer. He's a friend of mine who's a comics journalist, and we collaborated together on a comic about Flint that is essentially what I told you. And the kind person also adapted a lot of the images so I could integrate them into what I'm sharing with you today. So, you know, joshkramer.net, I think it might be. Like, look at you should look him up. He's great.
Can you talk about the decision-making process of why the city didn't use any of the corrosion chemicals? Was it strictly a cost basis?
This is a very good question that is literally being talked about in courtrooms, like right now. So, I mean, why wouldn't you? Like, I mean, apparently, I mean, it was a new concept to me. I hadn't heard of it, corrosion control, before the Flint stuff started rising. But folks who are water professionals, it's just a very basic treatment thing. It's not real. It's not some subtle you know, it's intuitive, you know, and like people wouldn't even think that it wouldn't have been used. It was very confusing to folks. There's a few different ways, I guess, to look at this. Like the switch was supervised by the Department of Environmental Quality, and they're the ones who hold the bulk of the responsibility for how things played out there. You know, there's like some city officials who were working at the plant. One of them in particular, like, flagged it just before the switch. She's like, I don't think it's ready. If it goes live, it's over my, you know, objections. But the DEQ said it was fine. And apparently, according to some court records, he specifically asked, like, do we need the corrosion control? And they're like, no, we don't. And later on, when the EPA was trying to figure out why they're getting all these complaints about brown water and so on, you know, there's this email message where, you know, an EPA worker is writing to a DEQ person. He's like, there must be some kind of corrosion control plan. What are you using for it? And the response back, which is now a really important court document, is, you know, it was sort of implied. It was very misleading. It just said, yes, we have like an optimized corrosion control plan, without saying what it is, which was nothing. Like, they had no plan. The DEQ says that they had a reading of the law that meant that they only needed to do two 6-month rounds of monitoring of the water quality before deciding if corrosion control was needed, and if so, what kind. So, and their argument is like the law was very misleading and such in that way. But if that's also so, their sort of misleading response to the EPA also looks kind of confusing. Some other, I guess, pieces of information. Apparently, corrosion control, the chemical itself that's commonly used, isn't particularly expensive, but the city plant didn't have like the device to, like the equipment to use it, like that the plant didn't have, and perhaps that was a factor. You know, they didn't have a lot of basic upgrades, and maybe this was one other thing they didn't have, and just felt that they could kind of kick the can down the road, and then they're going to get onto this like new plant, though they were going to have to treat that water too anyway. It's baffling. So the argument for it, like why they didn't use it, is confusing to me, and I don't think I've summarized it very neatly, but that's because they should have just used it. Yeah.
Thanks. You know, this makes me wonder, listening to your story about working for EPA or DEP, EPA, and other environmental disasters, and the overwhelming support that most Americans have for a clean environment and for protections. I'm wondering if anyone in this room knows if there's a collaborative effort between the Kennedy School and the law school to put together a think tank about how to make changes in the way our government works and represents the people. Because I don't know about that, but I think that so many things come down to, you know, looking at the financial impact of a few who don't want to have a financial impact that then affects the many. And so it's got me wondering.
Sure. Well, that just idea of this being like a thing that can bring people together, like water, like who's anti-safe drinking water? You know what I mean? Like of all things that might bring people together, this seems like it would be one. Yes.
Well, if you have a lot of money and you can bundle a lead filter and a cement filter on your house, full house filter, you can just isolate yourself from the effects.
Yeah, that I mean that's honestly that's something I try to spend some time on. Like if you look at like how like the ethic behind building drinking water systems in the first place, it's this really beautiful like in the spirit of the public good kind of thing, and people were so proud of it, and they had all these waterworks parks and you know beautiful ornate buildings as lovely as like a library or a city hall. Like it was like really quite celebrated as a thing that like brought people together in a way that was emotionally powerful as well as wonderful for all these other reasons. That is definitely, I think, a thing we've gotten away from, you know, not just like every little community kind of wants its own drinking water system as, you know, this Flint kind of and other communities breaking off Detroit's kind of part of that story. People want wells or like their own kind of private thing, you know, and I understand people need to do what they need to do to take care of whatever their immediate health needs are, but we can't like, I don't want us to get away from this idea that, you know, that I don't want us to like get away from the idea of public water systems. You know, I think they're beautiful and important and liberating, and it's can be a wonderful way to just very literally like stitch together a community that is that is inclusive, you know, like you belong and you belong and you belong and you belong, and it can bring like all kinds, you know, into one thing, and they are literally better off by like public health wise when everybody's connected, which is something important to think with a lot of folks dealing with shutoffs. When everybody's connected and that water's moving more quickly, everybody is healthier, you know, and it's like I mean. It's not just a metaphor. It's something I really would love to see us invest in.
So just one small, I'm the last one to be an apologist for the law school, but we are sponsoring this event, and we are the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. There's some justice work that goes on in this law school.
He's got
Yeah, I was just wondering who were some of the outside specialists who came in who were particularly helpful in both figuring out what was going on as well as publicizing it nationally?
Yeah, that's a great one. So first of all, with like the asterisk that like, well, you know, that the community themselves like were the driving force in this one. Really, truly. And no outside experts would have come had they not reached out. But there's a few. The first really important one is an EPA worker who worked at the Chicago office. His name's Miguel Del Toro. He's the one who went out of his way to test one particular Flint mom's house who had excessively high lead rates, like the absolute highest rates that were, you know, for a lot of reasons she had that. And it was affecting her family's health in a serious way. And he wrote a memo that ended up being reported on shortly later. It changed everything. It was the first document to show, it was the first time that like we kind of broke the narrative of the state says it's fine and the residents say it's not. Suddenly you had like data, you know, and an official expert, I guess, you know, kind of validating what the residents had been saying all along. Journalists were asking more and better questions. It led to a number of other things. There was also a citywide water test to create more and better data, kind of expand what they did at that memo to show that it wasn't just a single house's problem, and that was done with some folks from Virginia Tech who helped, you know, had equipment and so on that were able to test it and resources for that. And also there's a pediatrician. She like basically like even once we got to the point where like you could be like, oh, there's this huge lead problem all across the city. Nobody's really going to do anything until you show that children are hurt, frankly. There was a pediatrician who works at a hospital who also has a book out. She was able to show some data from the hospital that was able to correlate, since the water switch, some rising rates in the blood levels of Flint children. So all of that played an important role. And local journalists. They're the best. We were just chatting a little bit about this. So like, this is like, it's just, honestly, I would love to hear from more folks in the room about what you think of this, because there is just this, like, the court process has been baffling for a lot of reasons. There's special prosecutors, there's been a number of indictments, there's been a number of plea deals, it's all very messy, it's gonna take forever to work its way all the way through. But yeah, the court decision on Monday was essentially saying that the previous governor, the two-term governor Rick Snyder, would not be immune from prosecution, as it shifted a previous decision, which. Right, catches a lot of people's eye, right? Because that's honestly, when I do events, that's one of the main questions I get. People are like, why isn't the governor in jail? Why isn't the governor in jail? And I do think, to be fair, there's a lot of other people who are in less prominent, visible roles who have more direct responsibility for what happened. And I don't want, and sometimes that people just assume it's scapegoats if they hadn't heard of them, which isn't true. But yeah, of course, people are like very curious about the person who has the most power to do something in the state, who is responsible for the very agencies that caused and perpetuated this crisis. And as we were chatting about just a little bit ago, like, will we have like some kind of like accountability aspect to this Flint water story? I mean, this crisis wasn't caused by a natural disaster. It wasn't caused by some corner-cutting company that was blinded by profit. It was caused by public officials who made wrong decisions that caused and perpetuated this crisis. And I feel like, folks in Flint who want to see some kind of vindication in courtroom are like not wrong, I think there's some folks who have this tenor of like, oh, get over it, or oh, they didn't mean to, and oh, let's move on and just fix the problem, and but like, I think that's right. Like, at some point, you as a community, as a society, we've got to be like, this is not okay. And with environmental cases, and I'm sure you know this better than me, like people in the room, like, they're so tricky. I mean, it seems like they always end, even the most famous ones that they make movies about, they always end in settlements with no admission of guilt, right? Like, they're hard cases when you're dealing with like motives and who's responsible for what and how do you handle this. Like, maybe there's some lead poisoned child in Flint, but maybe he would have been lead poisoned anyway, given all these other inputs of lead. They're tricky things to show. This is a cumulative thing. A lot of the consequences don't show up over the time. Lead's invisible. It's like there's all these reasons that make this challenging. And but this very shaky way that's being made through with a number of criminal investigations and court cases is like one way or another going to set some kind of precedent. I would like it to be a good one. And I think this, a meaningful one, I guess, that goes beyond even our own state. And this decision that includes the person who is at the very top of the chain in the state is, is significant, and I'm very curious where that goes. Like what else can come out of this? How else are we going to tell the story? Who is included in it? Yeah. I think one thing with him is like, even if you go by his story, there's still a question. Like, his story is like, he did not know that the water crisis was of the scope it was until late September 2015, which was like 2 weeks before they went back onto Detroit Water as an emergency relief effort. Way belated, but a huge victory. And even if that's true, let's say he's totally telling the truth there. Let's just assume it's true. Even then, what? Because this had been like anybody who was in that state at all would have. It was everywhere. It was all over the like local news. His agencies were like responding to it in all these ways. It was reported on like statewide public radio. General Motors, a whole engine plant that's still in Flint, 5 months after the switch, noticed that the water was corroding its parts so seriously that they needed to leave the water system and join a suburbs water system. That made a lot of headlines. That worried a lot of people, like, if it's not good enough for the machines, why is it okay for me? And the state said it was fine. And it took another year before the state said, well, maybe it isn't fine. And if the governor, by his own account, if he really had no idea anything was going on until late September 2015, that's still a problem. Okay, that's it. Catherine?
If you were emergency manager of the world, what would you want to have happen in Flint? And what, do you want a public apology and from whom? Do you want people to go to jail? What would be ideal?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And honestly, just to be fair, like people want different things, and different things are different important. When sometimes we talk about what the community wants, like Flint in particular is infamously not unanimous. There's like people have really heated internal disagreements. So, but I think like one important mechanism, well, yes, I do think apologies matter. The governor did apologize, like unlike a lot of folks. So that's something, I guess. But like, meaningful apologies, right? And like, I would like a response that, like a reform response that looks not just at the technical aspects of this problem, which some of that lead and water testing and get rid of the lead pipes and all that stuff does address. That's great, that's important. But this wasn't just a technical problem, right? Like there's a reason this happened in Flint, and it wouldn't have happened in Ann Arbor, and it wouldn't have happened in Grand Rapids. And I think we need these like to look beyond the technical fixes to see this as a larger policy issue. This like the strategic decades-long disinvestment that the state has been doing in particularly its communities of color like all around the state. I think the emergency manager law that is still exactly the same. The unusually secretive open records laws Michigan has. There's only 2 states in the country where both the legislature and the governor's office are exempt from open records requests. One is Michigan, and one is this state. That's a problem. That's really a problem. And because we have realized as more or less, have we? I guess we're doubting it, but generally, like the whole concept of democracy is that no one person knows everything, and that you need this like wisdom of the collective, to get things through. And they're not going to get things right all the time, but more of the time than if we go with the authoritarian model. And I think remembering that in all kinds of aspects of our how we shape our communities is not just politically, but in other ways, I think is really important. I want the voices of folks in the community to not just have a say, like a public comments period in policies that affect their lives, but have like some empowered role in the process because they know things that matter. The lived experience is important. The dismissal of the lived experience proved incalculably dangerous in this case. It's probably playing out elsewhere and doesn't have the spotlight that Flint had. I feel like it's really important to focus on our processes and not just the technical challenges of lead pipes, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we couldn't have closed on a better note in terms of what we call community justice. So I really appreciate it, and I echo that ASU students. When we all grow up, we could all be Anna Clark. So, and in the meantime, the Coop is here. The book is for sale outside. It's $27. It's the Coop member's price. So I encourage you to go out and make a purchase. And thank you all for coming.